And I think most of us get that. I think most of us get the idea. We have sin that pops up, and it keeps coming up, and it drives us crazy sometimes. And we need Jesus to cleanse us each day. But again, I wonder if we can get our minds around the joy that Jesus comes to cleanse us each day. Even when we're banging our heads up against the wall, wondering how we can be sinning this particular way over and over again. Can we imagine the joy that Christ has to cleanse our feet, our spiritual feet? It's something that's good to think about. And John gives us even more to think about as we keep moving on in this chapter. Verse 23 is where John introduces us to the disciple whom Jesus loved. And we find out in chapter 21 that this is actually John's self-description. This is how he looks at himself, and it's a surprising window into the kind of relationship that Jesus had with his disciples, because John apparently is so impacted by the daily love of Christ for him that's how he thinks of himself. That's how he describes himself in the gospel itself. That's how he's inspired to look at himself. And as we look at the beginning of verse 23, we get a hint that the translators of the ESV and the NIV even don't know what to do with the kind of affection that John has for Jesus, and vice versa. In verse 23, they describe John as reclining at table close to Jesus in the ESV, or next to him in the NIV. But the literal reading in the Greek there in verse 23, and you can see it in the New American Standard Version, is that John is reclining in the chest or in the bosom of Jesus. He's actually leaning up right against Christ when this happens. And this is especially surprising because this is the painful moment that Jesus is announcing his betrayal. And it's arguably the greatest betrayal in the history of mankind. You can imagine the emotions he's feeling. He's deeply troubled. And yet, he is allowing John to lie up against him, just like a child lies up against their father. And he's not pushing him away. And that is a striking picture of affection. In defense of the translators of the ESV and the NIV, I read this verse and I would have had no clue that that's what John was getting at if I hadn't been to Pakistan in the late 90s and experienced this for myself. I spent 9 months as a missionary in Pakistan. I was teaching English and got to visit a number of families. And we would sit on the floor and eat just like they did back then. And we would, after the meal, there would be pillows, and you would recline on the pillows, and you'd visit and enjoy time together, have some tea. And what would happen is close friends would actually lean right up against each other. And they didn't have the Minnesota policy where you got to have an arm's length personal space, and you feel safe and secure and happy and comfortable. People would be leaning up against you when they felt like you were somebody they could trust. I had to get used to that. But after weeks and weeks of having this happen, I started to just realize there was an affection in this room after a meal that I just had not experienced any other place. It was just amazing. And so when I read this and see John leaning up against Christ after the meal, it just makes me think of those moments in Pakistan and how much more affection did Christ have for his disciples and then for each other than I ever got to experience there. Affection just oozes off the page here. Although, to acknowledge skepticism like I have, you still might wonder, well, okay, John is leaning against Jesus. John is the one who says the disciple whom Jesus loved is his description. We don't hear that from any other disciples. So, did John just have a special relationship with Christ? And are we making too much out of this? And it's a good question. And we get a very strong answer 4 chapters later in John 17:23. And this verse comes near the end of Jesus' high priestly prayer. And in this verse, Jesus prays that he would be in all believers, that they may become perfectly one, so that the world may know that you sent me and loved them even as you loved me. Now that's a lot of ideas right there, but concentrate on that last phrase. You sent me and loved them even as you loved me. Think for a second about the love not a more intense and powerful and deep love in all of creation that exists between the Father and the Son. Their love is something we can't comprehend. The love of the Trinity is an amazing, deep thing. And what does John say about that love in 17:23? He says that you, God, the Father, loved all of them, which is all of us, even as you loved me. So the intensity of love in the Godhead is just like the intensity of love that God feels towards each of his disciples. Not just John in particular, but towards each disciple. And that same intensity of love is what he feels constantly towards us. It's as if we're in the room leaning back against Christ all the time. Brothers and sisters, we need to know this, because we can't give our hearts to God, we can't worship God from the heart that we were made to, we can't live our lives for him unless we are receiving the love that he has for us. Like John says in 1 John 4:9, we love because he loved us first. We need to see his love to be able to express that kind of love in our lives to him and to others. And this is a painful topic for a lot of us, because while the love of God can be obvious on a page, it's very difficult for many of us to embrace in real life. And we might be thinking, it's easy for John because he was with Christ, the disciples were with Christ, he got to talk to him, he got to see him each day. You know, me, I don't get to talk to Christ face to face, I don't get to walk down the roads with him, I don't get to lean up against him or have him come wash my feet personally. Everything feels like it's at a distance. And sometimes when I cry out to him in my pain, it feels like I get no answer. So how can I feel the love of God when God just feels so distant away from me? That is a real struggle for a lot of us. And some of us, it's a struggle we might not even be aware of. For me, I wasn't really acutely aware of this until I spent 2 years in seminary, or about a year and a half to be precise. This is about a year and a half ago. I came into seminary and had a strong sense of call of God in my life, which we needed to be able to leave work and to sell the house and spend a lot of money for 4 years. And so I came into seminary expecting, okay, God is going to do a great work in my life, and I'm going to feel closer to him than I've ever felt before. But as is common with most seminary students, you're studying so much about God, and you're dealing with so many difficult questions and objections. The distance seems to just get deeper and longer between you and God, and that's what I felt. And it was harder for me because I just come out of a 10-year struggle with depression. I'm still dealing with a lot of anxiety and issues in my heart that were really hard. And to feel this distance in seminary was hard. And then I was feeling like I wasn't growing like I was expecting I would. I was still struggling with the same kind of pain and difficulty in life. And some days it just felt like my soul was having a life, the energy leached right out of it. And I remember pacing up in our upstairs bedroom and just pleading with God and saying, God, I need to see you. It's so hard to know about you, but not to see you face to face. If you could just show up, just appear to me one time, it would make all the difference in the world. If you could show me your love personally for me, that would be so much better. I could go on with confidence. And I didn't really expect an answer to that prayer right at that moment. Just felt like I needed to release some pressure in my heart. So I was surprised when a verse came to mind. And I'm sure all of us have had this kind of experience where there's an issue and God brings something from Scripture to mind that goes right to the heart of it and just cuts right through in a way that we don't expect. And the verse for me was actually what Joel mentioned earlier in the service. It was from Colossians 1:17. It's just a simple verse. In him, Christ, all things hold together. And it hit me at that moment when that verse came to mind that Jesus was never apart from me and I was never apart from Christ. because every moment He's sustaining every inch of my being, every inch of who I am. And I know it's a simple thought, but I hadn't really had it sink in until that point. And what started to sink in was the idea that I'm being held by God. I feel myself being held by God every moment. I couldn't be closer to God every moment. And the way that He holds me is not dispassionate, it's not with a neutral feeling or an obligation. He's holding me with the kind of love that exists between the Son and the Father, the kind of intensity that exists in the divine Godhead is what I am being held together by right at this moment. And just the thought that every part of me was being held by God in that kind of love was eye-opening. And of course, I like to think these things out, so I started to think about, well, that means that the floor, the furniture in the room, the trees outside the window, every person I encounter is also being sustained in this great divine love. And they are a display of His love, especially all the things in creation that tell of the glory of God. They are displaying His love for me, and I started to see that my life is being flooded with evidence and communication of God's love. And the problem was not that God was distant. The problem was that in my sin, blinders had come up in front of my eyes, and I'd gotten so good at filtering out the message of God's love that it was as if it wasn't even there. A year and a half in the seminary, and I was wrestling with this, and God in His grace started a work in me that was really significant. And He showed me, as I started to push these filters back by His grace and His strength, that I was also filtering out love in relationships, His love in my wife, His love in my friends, my family, His life in the church especially. And what I would tend to do is I'd be so focused on the way that they would rub my old wounds and bother me that I couldn't open my eyes to see all the ways His love was working in their hearts and how they really had love for me. And this made a big difference. It was kind of like if you go out and sit in a garden, and maybe if you'd be blindfolded or wearing really dark glasses, and you just start to push the glasses up and just have the colors start to flood into your life. That's the kind of vividness that the love of God really has. It really takes on as we start to see it. And I was blown away, and I continue to be blown away as I keep trying to push back the filters of God's strength. This is a process, and I want to encourage you, this is a process that's not just for someone in seminary who's struggling, but this is a process that we all need to be part of. You know, it doesn't make suffering go away. It's not an easy answer to all of life's problems, but the more we see the love of God, the more suffering carries less deadly weight, and the more hard questions don't drag us down so much in our souls. And these things can be burdens that we can carry and we can hand over to Christ and be blessed by Him in. And that is why we see Jesus pouring so much of His love into His disciples and really putting it on display for all of us in His last hours. Because this is something we need to see. And of course, this is why He pours out His love at the cross, because He is there to set us free from sin, to crucify sin and nail it to the cross so that the power of sin is broken and